My name is Philip Martin, and I'm the co-owner of Philip Martin Gallery here in Los Angeles with my partner, Portia Hine. And I'm thrilled to be talking with Daniel Dove today about his show, reAnimal, which we are featuring at the gallery through the the end of November, Thanksgiving weekend. It's a remarkable show with some amazing paintings, and Daniel and I have known each other for a very long time. And I am really excited to have a chance to talk with you. How are you doing today, Daniel?
I'm doing well, thanks. How about yourself, Philip?
I'm doing great. I'm doing awesome. Well, thanks so much for doing this with me, and thank you everyone for joining us. So yeah, let's get kind of into it. So the show is called reAnimal. You want to talk a little bit about what you were thinking about in terms of this body of work?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe I'll start with the title, even though the title did not come first. The title sort of emerged rather late, but titles have always been somewhat difficult for me because I just sort of deal with paintings, in terms of the virtues and the problems that they present in my studio, but I don't necessarily have a verbal way of defining them until somewhat late. But in this case, it's just kind of a hybrid between reanimate and animal, because so many of the works in the show are basically like industrial or junk materials that have been assembled in order to create something that sort of looks like an animal. Sometimes that animal is very influenced by, a previous artwork. So in the case of the painting on the left here, you see in the center the horse from the center of Guernica, the Picasso painting. So there's a sense in which inert materials or discarded materials are reborn into something that might have an animate presence. And I would say that this group of works is actually more sort of coherent as a group than most of my shows, in the sense that I found, I guess, a thread of thinking that seemed to be productive for sort of longer and a more continuous time than I typically do. I typically bounce between motifs, but this time I kind of narrowed it down and stayed in a more focused range.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Is art history one of the found junk materials?
That's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't call art history
Junk.
Junk. I wouldn't call it junk, but I think that one of the things that I'm interested in is the way that the history of so-called high culture is actually just available to everybody, no matter what their circumstances are. So whether or not you're, an artist who went to elite schools and like have a fabrication lab, or you're somebody living out at the edge of Los Angeles in the desert, and you can be obsessed with Picasso either way. So in that sense, it's like this entry point into a culture in which I think some people are intimidated by art culture or galleries and so forth, but actually art history is contained in a book. It's a story. It's a set of people who have an expertise in it, and that the democracy of that, I think, is very attractive to me.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because Pat O'Neill is always a kind of interesting case or person for me. Avant-garde filmmaker, very important figure, information on our website. One of the pioneers of the opaque projector, which is an amazing film technique, and fun fact, killed the Emperor in Return of the Jedi. But his work goes back to the mid-60s, and he comes out of a kind of surrealist point of view. And even more specifically, he's from LA. So now I think in terms of a conversation about where we are in modern society, if you were in LA in the 1960s, there was no art museum, and the art museum was in fact 2 rooms in the Museum of Natural History that were lined with burlap. And he talks about art history basically being a Dali reproduction in Time magazine. He was like, okay, there's art history, moving on.
He killed the Emperor.
In Return of the Jedi, he did indeed. We actually had a person ask if Dali was an influence on you.
Oh, I mean, certainly Dolly was an influence in a very young stage, the way that, it's almost like as a art student, it's obligatory to go through a Dolly phase. And then maybe for a while in one's life, don't like Dolly because there can be something seemingly, I don't know, ingratiating maybe about the technique, so like the subject matter is weird, but the technique is familiar. And so it becomes like a kind of like formula. And then later in life, for me, I'm speaking personally,
Mhm.
you find yourself like, you see something in a painting, you're like, where have I seen that strange, unnerving form before? And then you think, oh, that was a Dali painting. And
Uh-huh.
so, you have to kind of reassess. Plus, you and I, Philip, were exposed to Peter Saul
Mhm.
early on, who went about sort of banging the drum of Dali and saying that everybody had really gotten him wrong, and that he was practically the best artist of the 20th century.
Yep.
Um, so in that sense, I think Dali has lived, had a rent-free room in my mind, um, with really differing attitudes towards it. But yeah, I would accept that as an influence at this point.
I thought it was an interesting question because I've never thought about it. Dolly is not someone that I spend any time with, and because there, as you point out, so many reasons to, in a way, object to Dolly. Like it's kind of purient, is it? And then I think like there's always the popular thing, and if someone's very popular, you might not think about that. But I think what's really interesting, if we were going to talk about Picasso, Dolly, art history, whatever we're discussing, is also to some degree, like picture making strategies. And there are so many fascinating picture making strategies in your work that maybe have connections with surrealists, in the sense that you have some ready-made things, you have some ready-made ways to think about things, you have the interaction with the physical material of the paint itself, which is kind of always going to be chance driven in a certain sense, yet you also have a kind of control in there. Anything there resonate with you?
Definitely that blend of control and chance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, even though I think that most encounters with my work would tend to push forward the control dimension of it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not rare that there are aspects of my paintings that actually, there's a big move at some point in the middle of the painting that actually puts the whole thing in jeopardy, and then I
Hmm.
kind of have to rescue the painting. So in some ways, I fight against my own proclivity toward control,
Hmm.
and also there's the sense in which control, at least in relationship to naturalism, which I think is one of the pillars of my work,
Hmm.
control is in a way all about removing the presence of the medium so you can create something like a transparent window to the world.
Hmm.
And the loss of control with paint is almost always to come back and emphasize its material qualities.
Hmm.
Because when you don't control paint, it looks like paint. It
Hmm.
can't help it. It's a liquid, and it's sort of like it resists your attempt to sort of shape it into these precise little forms. So in that sense, the loss of control isn't only a way of trying to give myself a problem that produces unexpected maneuvers on my part as a painter, but also a way in which the medium of paint as a physical material comes back and reasserts itself in the painting, no matter how illusionistic I might lean in my work.
Now that's really fascinating. So do you want to talk, maybe since we're on this, in a passage like this, which I interpret as being somewhat um, tool driven, chance driven, do you want to talk a little bit about how control is working in this painting, or the lack thereof? Not
So
lack
the
thereof, but I think control versus kind of openness to other information coming in.
Yeah, so part of it, you know, maybe it's more enlightening for me to talk about the ways in which it's not fully in my control, because I do think that the final product of the painting is, you know, in relationship to contemporary art, probably relatively on the side of like, okay, well, this person was, highly intentional in many dimensions of the work. So, well, first of all, part of it comes from the fact that in the building of the source material, sometimes I am in collaboration with another artist. In this case, Molly Champlin, herself a very fine painter, somebody who also has let's say, a lot more dexterity in the digital realm. Made a 3D virtual 3D model of the horse of Guernica based on these rather clunky drawings I gave her. I drew the horse. I tried to figure out how all the planes would work. I hit the wall of my sculptural intelligence immediately, and then she kind of figured out some of those problems, and then delivered back to me this 3D model that I knew that I loved, but I did not know what to do with. And so there's this like long period of the ideation where I'm just looking at this thinking like, well, okay, this has some of the virtues of what Picasso did, but where's my place in this? And actually, a perhaps slightly embarrassing aspect of the creation of this painting was that there was like a late night. There was this sort of desperate all day long searching around for like, what do I do with this thing that I love? And I ended up reading the Wikipedia entry on Guernica.
Nice.
Which noted that a couple of the shapes on the surface of the horse were actually these abstract representations of spears. And so I'm like, that is the thing, somehow that this, and because the horse is in this sort of position of agony. And so that, I knew that I wanted that to happen. And so then I played around in the digital realm, created a source that is the intersection of these various forms. Okay, and so that there's some like chaos that ends up getting worked out in the ideation phase. And then in the creation of the painting phase, particularly the thing you refer to, those textures on the surfaces are, even though on a relatively small scale, I actually don't ever know how those are going to come out until I do them, because they involve a layering of paint in which you have to put down a layer that looks nothing like the final color that you want. Then you have to wait till it gets tacky, and then you have to start applying the color that you want. And oftentimes, when you do that, it looks terrible. And then you just have this window of time before the paint dries to manipulate it and get it to look like, well, okay, that has the surface qualities I want, that has the light qualities that I want, physical object. So on a micro scale, there's a sense of like, chaos and panic at times about how these forms are actually going to work.
Well, again, and then I'll move on to kind of this next painting, but I think that is one of the things that's really fascinating here, is that these planes just work in space, and the spatial definition that you have, what you're telling people, okay, here's the distance to here, here's the distance to here, here's the distance to that, it's very articulated. But it's intriguing that here I can imagine, okay, we're articulating with applied paint and we're simply moving down this thing, and maybe we're making it warmer, maybe we're making it cooler. We're doing something to suggest how, using observed color, how color is functioning here. But it is interesting that this is also functioning in space. But as we point out, it's a little more tool driven. And so you're saying that sometimes it just doesn't work.
Oh yeah. I mean, they're definitely, scraping downs and repainting, rebooting an area, a lot of forehead clasping. For sure.
And I guess you have to define where that effect is going to happen. So I suppose you have to like mask off or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the processes I use are such that if I didn't do a lot of masking, the painting would perpetually have, sort of ambient, like junk marks that weren't intentional, that were, the quality of one form would just be kind of haphazardly smeared on another adjacent form.
Well, that's really interesting because, again, we're getting into, I think, expectations people have around the kind of painting that you do, observed painting. And the sense that you and I have grappled with, because, going back into grad schools in the 90s, I don't know if people still talk about academic painting, but we talked about academic painting, which, meant a very certain kind of realism that at that time was completely rejected in an effort to make something new. And in fact, painting in general in the late 90s. Well, we can discuss the history of painting as we watched it over 30 years in this other whole sense, which I think is super, super fascinating. But the point that I'm making is that you found something completely new that nobody does. It's very interesting because your work, in the one hand, is about observed painting. It kind of satisfies like a realist's desire, or whatever that means. It has the quality of this knowledge of painting and what painting can do. It's always thrilling to see paintings, but sometimes you're like, wow, this is an awesome painting, but this person doesn't actually know how to do this materially, because painting is a material practice that takes a long time to do it. And then on top of that, within this tradition, you have three-dimensional modeling, you have masking off, which would have been is a certain technique that came into a certain period of, to say, do hard edge. You have the viability of the input of, we're just going to call it that, junk art history, the viability of the Wikipedia entry. It's really fascinating how all that's happening. And then, there you are, the cook in the kitchen.
Yeah, I want to apologize to any and all art historians for having consulted Wikipedia, by the way.
No, there is no such thing as high and low anymore, as you pointed out. I mean, at this point, why do we even have those categories? I mean, they're hierarchical and they're oppressive in many ways. And I think that the notion that something's high and can't be touched just means that we can't interact with it democratically, not to go off the mark, but I think it's a good thing.
Well, and certainly reflects, the way that I grew up, in which I grew up in a family that never went to a gallery, never went to a museum, had no interest in art whatsoever. And so whatever place in that exists in my life is something that I had to, claim for myself, but also just be able to construe myself as somebody who could participate in that. And that's a pretty heavy lift when you come from, really modest circumstances. I think that one thing I would add, to this, kind of like synthesis of all these different things you're talking about is that while heavily influenced by naturalism, none of the things in any of my paintings actually exist.
Right.
I mean, right. So they all
forgot to mention that, but yes, exactly.
Yeah. So they might be heavily influenced by something that exists, like an artwork from the past, or something that I encounter, near Joshua Tree or something like that. But the actual particular manifestation is always, no matter how realistic something might look, it's actually a fictitious object, and arises from sort of like the blank sketchbook page. And in that sense, when you're trying to build something up from like a precondition of nothingness on that blank page, then of course everything that you're interested in or attracted to has a possibility of entering the work, as opposed to, say, being devoted to a motif that you find in the world, in which you give all of yourself to maybe capturing that thing.
Yeah, and I mean that's I think, of course, then what is so exciting in many ways. I mean, when you think about an academic painter like Jerome, for example, I mean, the guy, he's a killer painter. I mean, you can't not love those paintings. But then it's so obvious, of course, that they're invented. They have all manner of structurally racist aspects to them. They're insanely sexist. And I'm not saying any of those things with regard to your work, but my point just being that artworks exist, people make them, they are this way. And so the power to present something that appears to be something that you see and have actually seen plays this incredibly vital role in terms of how representation works and how we perceive things and how we put ourselves in front of things as a painting.
I mean, for me, this sort of cognitive dissonant moment
Yeah.
about academic painting always comes with Bouguereau. Where,
Yes.
like in my mind, I'm like, I don't like Bouguereau, and then I get in front of a Bouguereau, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, even Dali, we kind of went going back to that as a certain kind of touchstone. Now, we will move on to the next one, but one thing that I think is interesting is you mentioned your background. You're from Austin, Texas, and one thing you said to me with regard to these pieces is that growing up in Austin, Texas, you were part of this American capitalism situation where everything is just expanding, development, everything, not stopping, never stopping. And then you went to Cleveland. And of course, we think about glass, tires, all of these things that Cleveland provided to the American economy in the first part of the 20th century. And then this kind of situation that you have in a classic Rust Belt city. Cleveland obviously is awesome, and there's millions of things going on. But one aspect of it is that you saw major art historical sculptures, Dubuffet or Calder, that had been, say, purchased by a corporation, and then, like, in a certain sense, the urban core had decayed around it.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about that juxtaposition. Living in Austin, it's a town that is, perpetual anxiety about growth and how do we control it. And a place like Cleveland, Ohio, has a perpetual obsession with Renaissance.
Yes.
And so you really got a sense of, like, things are emergent in a place like Austin, and then you go to Cleveland, and you're right, it still has lots of amazing things about it as a place. But one of the things it also has is this history of incredible wealth and incredible investment in the arts. But then some of it at the edges has lost, its caretakers,
Yeah.
because of the exodus, because of globalism. And so I was really provoked by this, by the sadness of the parts of Cleveland that had this sense that they were created with a great sense of optimism, and then are well past that point, definitely living in the aftermath.
Yeah.
And I'm not
Well,
saying the whole
now it's
city.
the aftermath of the aftermath. I mean,
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a question as to whether or not, which cities do get to have a renaissance, or which cities sort of, like, need to keep the hope alive.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not to go off on, although I always love to go off on various tangents, but, really enjoying listening. I was like listening to Sean Carroll's amazing podcast he talks a lot about entropy. And one of the things about entropy that is intriguing, and obviously I don't, who knows if I even understand it, but the point just being that the flow of time is simply the movement of low entropy to high entropy. And what that means is that you start with states with less combinative possibilities, and you move to states with more combinative possibilities. So there you have this seemingly organized trajectory of Austin, where it's going to more and more combinative possibilities, and it's all going great. And then you have this situation in Cleveland where those combinative possibilities are suddenly starting to, like, things are starting to fray and fall apart, best laid plans, as it were. And then now, of course, in the second decade of the 20th century, when we're dealing with fascist governments and totalitarian states and, all these various things that are happening, it's a sort of odd and interesting aspect of things, but just a side note. What about this painting?
So this painting has one of its inspirations comes from the Picasso painting Girl with Mandolin.
Yes.
And this is also a collaboration with Molly Champlin
It's beautiful. This is a fantastic picture.
Oh, thank you, Philip. So I basically did my very, very clunky drawing of what I imagined Girl with Mandolin would be if you translate it into sort of a sculpture that was built primarily out of planes. I gave it to Molly. I gave her some pictures of Courtney Love's hair, and then Molly came up with a 3D model, and then it was up to me to sort of figure out, like, okay, well, light, surface, but also the place. And in this case, I imagined that I wanted this painting to be sort of balanced, both having there be something kind of radiant and also very kind of energetic about the presence of this object, which is undeniably just still, right?
Mhm.
Like, I mean, one thinks about rock and roll as an incredibly vibrant art form. Well, this is this is an artifact of that is definitely an artifact, no
Yeah.
longer, sort of animate. And also the way that, the music fair as this kind of archetypal experience in our culture is both one that has this, incredible spectacle aspect to it,
Mhm.
but also the aftermath of a music fair can be just disaster for
Yeah.
the place that has it. So I was interested in sort of trying to combine both the radiant, sort of vibrant qualities of this place with also something that is kind of like the remnants or the rather once again the aftermath of something that had a lot of energy, but that energy might be dissipating at this point. Wanted to have both. I wanted to have like the vibrancy and the intensity of that reference, but also a sense of like the way that these things, there are remnants, there are artifacts and aftermath to these intense experiences.
Well, it's interesting. One thing in this that's kind of fun is this kind of rubble cross-hatching rubble motif that you've used in different works here appears almost to my eye as a kind of like crowd surfing moment. And there's a nice kind of metaphorical play between people as rubble in the audience, so to speak. There are a remarkable group of bull paintings in this show. These are smaller paintings, smaller than some of the paintings that you've been doing. Do you want to talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, so they're all variations on a bull as a original an impetus or catalyst, and this is the first time that I've used any form of AI form generation as an influence.
Okay.
This is a very nascent technology. In not the technology has been around for a while, but it's sort of availability to painters, and one can sort of there's obviously a randomized aspect. It can get very sophisticated in terms of form, but there isn't any subjective mind that's actually controlling the outputs. And
Yeah.
so as an artist interacting with it, one has to figure out what the right inputs are, but then one also has to figure out like, okay, what about all these images I have is useful? And and so in that sense, the collaboration is with now an artificial mind, and these being my first foray into that. I feel like I was just sort of like trying to roam the territories and see all the different kind of formal properties that I already have preloaded in me that I can connect to an image that might have a random generation aspect to it. And it's something that I'm interested in. It's funny. There was this controversy that just swept through the art world because a guy won an art fair by submitting a digital image that
Yeah.
basically was just created in an
Love
AI
that.
model.
It's so great.
There was this Twitter war about whether this guy had cheated or not, right?
That's ridiculous. That's absurd.
And I think that the situation, I also think that was just it's bizarre how somebody could be dragged for
Yeah.
on Twitter, but I think
Well, I mean, this is the Terry Dedev's point about Duchamp. Art is what you call it, and that's what's important. That's why it means something to us as humans.
yeah, and also it's it's these tools. It's like saying that somebody's using photography and they're cheating, or somebody's using
It's absurd.
yeah, and so it's not a question. All ends up being a question of what can you do with these things.
This is a smaller version of the other painting. Yep.
Yeah, right. So this is it's not really a study. It's sort of like the first iteration, and I realized the second iteration
Yeah.
could exist. And so like everybody had access to the programs that Julia Moretu used, but
Mhm.
no one made a Julia Moretu
Yeah.
out of it, right? And so in that sense, I feel like there's going to be this emergent wave in contemporary painting in which painters sort of confront the influence of AI and their imagery. But I'm still confident that the final iteration can never be outsourced to a mind, no matter how sophisticated, that doesn't possess subjective experience.
Oh, well, okay. So we've only got, we're basically at the end here. We can wrap it up, or we can spend a few minutes on this topic, because I don't know if you and I have really talked about this. We also have a little question from the Q&A that I might pull out here, but what is super interesting is, have you seen, I'm not remembering what it's called off the top of my head, but it is this amazing app where basically you say what you want an image of. Like it could be like, mosque at night. And then it searches through the internet and provides you with that image. And they are amazing. They are totally amazing, very interesting, super stylized, and I guess have to do with the choice functions of human algorithms and what we call something. Going back to that question of art being what you call it, it seems like it's doing that. But once again, given that, they're saying that one area that could really be in trouble is classical music, because computers can write classical music that people cannot tell the difference between that and something that was written by somebody. Also, you have what was the other example that I was going to use that I forgot. Anyway, I think it's a very this thing is a very interesting question. And I think that is actually, again, plays into one of the reasons why, coming back out of COVID, I felt like art was so important, because one realizes the power of human expression and what that means. So to me, somebody winning a contest because they did this thing, I think is fascinating. It's extremely interesting. And it's simply one thing to put into play, given the fact that we have potentially machines that could write music. We have machines that can write our political narratives. We have machines that can write our romantic narratives if we're involved in some, her type chatbot relationship with everything. I mean, this is just life and what art grapples with.
Yeah, we have sentient AI, according to one engineer at Google.
Well, they said that there is someone who said that sentient AI is very possible, and the problem that this person had is that AI had access to the internet, so they couldn't test it to see if it was sentient, because it would be able to know what that would look like, was one of their reasons. So they wanted to figure out a different way.
Well, it's
Get it to exist so that it wouldn't know.
I mean, this way of like, giving a program a verbal prompt, and then it scrapes a million images.
Yeah.
From it's so there's human consensus.
Who doesn't want to see that? I think that's incredible. I love that.
Right, and there's subjectivity in the very beginning as to what everybody put up on the internet and what they called it, and then there's subjectivity at the end where the artist is sort of trying to turn this thing into something that is communicative and expressive.
And that is it. Is, as an artist, it's understanding what communication is. Okay, couple questions. Number one, your color palette in relationship to mid-century modernism.
Well, mid-century modernism is one of the threads of influence in my work, and so I don't want to give an overly simple answer to that question, other than yes. I mean, I'll just download a bunch of mid-century modern patterns sometimes and just look at the color combination. So yeah, definitely an influence.
The other comment in the chat is that the image generator is called Dolly.
So oh yes, actually that brings yes. So DAL.
I mean, what more do you want? What more do you want? I think I'm thinking of a different one. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called something else, but I think that's awesome. That's why we do this, because I love the webinar. It's so good.
Yeah, I don't know how I missed that in the beginning of our conversation, but it's true. DALL-E. It's an
exactly
amazing.
So genius.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody, thank you for joining us today. I love that you came out. Really appreciate it. Daniel, do you have anything that we didn't talk about, or anything you want want to say?
I just want to add that I'm just honored to be the last show
Oh, totally.
at 2712 South Los
Yes.
Just the amount of joy that you brought to the art community, and, you know, artists, viewers of art, collectors.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah, just congratulations on the new space. If
Thank you.
you out there have not seen it, you have to see this new space. It's going to be amazing.
Yes, before anyone thinks we're closing, we are not closing. We are moving to 4,000 square feet in Glassell Park in the between downtown and Pasadena, which is super exciting. We have a first show of Sophie Treppendahl that opens January 7th. And then we're going to have a group show of all the gallery artists that opens during Freeze. So it's really awesome. We're really, really excited. Daniel, I'm thrilled that you'll participate in the Freeze show too. And I, again, am very happy that it's kind of amazing that you are at the end. I don't know if I always tell people this, but Daniel was my teacher at UT, even though we're the same age, because he went straight through school because he's a nerd and he didn't know what his other options were. And I braved the world alone for 3 years, which is where I learned to be a preparator in an art gallery in New Orleans, which is probably why I ended up on the dark side. If I just gone your way and had less options.
But what about that year you spent, like, you know, abroad mountain climbing and with Doctors Without Borders, Philip? I mean, don't sell yourself short.
That just simply never happened. All right. Bye, Daniel. Thanks for joining me. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Philip. Bye.